Good evening and welcome. Let's take a look at the top story that we are tracking for you, starting with the story that WION has been tracking very closely for the past 1 week. Israel and Gaza have finally called truce and agreed to a ceasefire after 11 days of violence and bloodshed. Now, a short while ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu gave his first address after the ceasefire was announced. Netanyahu hailed the Gaza operation as an exceptional success. As per the statement released by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office, the Security Cabinet had unanimously accepted the recommendations from Egypt for an unconditional ceasefire, which will come into force from early on Friday onwards. And as per Egypt's official news agency, Egypt will send 2 delegations from both Israel and Palestine to ensure the implementation of the ceasefire. In the last few days, it was Egypt that has been leading the international mediation to end the Israel-Palestine clashes. Leaders around the world have welcomed the development. On Thursday, U.S. President Joe Biden called the ceasefire a genuine opportunity for peace after 11 days of relentless bombing and rocket strikes.
You know, we've held intensive high-level discussions, hour by hour, literally. Egypt, the Palestinian Authority, and other Middle Eastern countries, with the aim of avoiding the sort of prolonged conflict we've seen in previous years when the hostilities have broken out. I extend my sincere gratitude to President al-Sisi and the senior Egyptian officials who played such a critical role in this diplomacy.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will also travel to West Asia in the coming days. As per reports, Blinken plans to meet his Israeli and Palestinian counterparts and discuss recovery efforts. Now, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was also quick to welcome the ceasefire. Guterres said that Israeli and Palestinian leaders have a responsibility to address the root causes of the conflict.
I appeal to the international community to work with the United Nations on developing an integrated, robust package of support for a swift, sustainable reconstruction and recovery that supports the Palestinian people and strengthens their institutions. I stress that Israeli and Palestinian leaders have a responsibility beyond the restoration of calm to start a serious dialogue to address the root causes of the conflict.
On Friday, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas expressed his relief as the ceasefire was announced. Maas had earlier visited the Middle East and held talks with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas.
Und jetzt wird es dabei darum gehen, sich mit den Ursachen dieses Konfliktes auseinanderzusetzen, dafür zu sorgen, dass es eine Lösung für den Nahostkonflikt gibt. Das ist nicht einfacher geworden in den letzten Tagen. Und großer Dank gilt auch vor allen Dingen den Ägyptern, die in der Vermittlung eine ganz wesentliche Rolle gespielt haben und mit den Vorschlägen, die sie gemacht haben, an beiden Seiten den Weg dafür geebnet haben, dass es endlich zu dieser Waffenruhe kommt.
As the world hopes for peace moving ahead, on Thursday, just a few hours before the truce would come into effect, the Israeli forces targeted a plastic factory in Gaza on Thursday night. The factory owners said that the airstrikes caused heavy damage. Meanwhile, cheers and whistles rang out across Gaza City early on Friday as the ceasefire came into effect. Across the Gaza Strip, residents took to the streets to celebrate the cessation of the hostilities after an 11-day conflict that left hundreds dead. At least 230 Palestinians were killed, including 65 children and 39 women during the conflict, with 1,710 people wounded. In Israel, 12 people, including a 5-year-old boy and a 16-year-old girl, were killed. Now, for more on this news development, Israel's former Minister of Justice, Yossi Beilin, is joining us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Beilin. Now, how do you assess the role of the international community in this conflict?
Since both sides, Hamas and the Israeli government, don't speak to each other, I think mainly because Hamas is not ready to speak to Israelis, including to people like myself. there is a need for a third party's involvement in order to end the violent rounds. And it repeated itself. It was again Egypt, which has its contacts with Hamas, and the United States behind the scenes, and not only behind the scenes, which eventually brought an end to this round. I mean, since both sides wanted to find a way how to put an end to it, I presume that it was not very difficult for them to do.
Right now, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said that Israeli and Palestinian leaders have the responsibility to address the root cause of the conflict. Can we expect a dialogue or a statement on that from the two sides?
I believe that the only way to deal with such matters is to renew the talks between Israel and the PLO. I'm speaking about the PLO because Hamas is not ready to negotiate. Hamas only tells us, go to hell. You know, it's not a good beginning of any negotiations. But with the PLO, we do have relations and we do have cooperation and coordination. And it is a pity that for such a long while, there are no political talks between the Israeli government and the government of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. And I hope that it will be renewed. I don't see how, because the current government of Israel for the last 2 years is a caretaker government. It is not in a position to negotiate with the other side. And I'm not sure whether Prime Minister Netanyahu is ready to the main thing which may open all the channels, and that is an agreement of Israel to partition the land. He once spoke about the two-state solution. That was, 12 years ago, and since then he forgot about it. And if this is the situation, then I believe that unless there is another government in Israel which is ready to make peace with the Palestinians, meaning to share the land with them, to have a partition, it would be very difficult to have something more than such ceasefires. And it is even then will be difficult because regretfully the PLO doesn't rule Hamas, and it will be very difficult for them to tell Hamas stop fire and get to the negotiating table. But this is the best option that we have, both the Palestinian realistic camp and the Israeli realistic camp.
Right now, Egypt will also be sending 2 security delegations to Israel and Palestine to ensure the implementation of this truce, while the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will also be traveling to West Asia in the coming days, where he plans to meet with Israeli and Palestinian counterparts. So what can we expect on that front?
Generally speaking, we are in a situation in which I at least don't believe that the Israeli government is going to initiate serious talks with the Palestinians in Ramallah, and the same goes for them. In such a situation, unlike the situation of '93, when I began the Oslo process, because it was an Israeli initiative, and only later on we informed the Americans about it. Here, without the involvement of the Americans and whoever is ready to help us, Egyptians, the Europeans, and others, there will be no talks. And this is why I'm glad that the Egyptians and the Americans are now involved, and that the original idea of the Biden administration, that since the situation on the ground is so difficult here, maybe the Americans will not be involved at all with the Middle East conflict and pivot their energy towards China and, of course, the internal problems and challenges. I think that today the Americans understand that such a decision is really unrealistic. And if you don't try to solve the Middle East problem, it comes to your home.
WION, now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.